The muscle-bound fighter sneered, confident no one could challenge him. "You can't fight," he mocked, eyes scanning the room. Bruce Lee didn't move. He didn't respond. He simply watched. 7 seconds later, the room fell silent, not from violence, but from a mastery so precise it left 9 witnesses speechless. In that brief, flawless moment, Bruce Lee didn't just prove himself. He showed what control really looked like. The room smelled faintly of sweat and liniment, a scent carried by years of training and repetition. Mats, worn thin in places, lined the floor, each scuff and tear telling stories of previous encounters. Some remembered, others forgotten. Mirrors covered the walls, reflecting the small crowd that had gathered. Though their reflections betrayed more than their faces, the anticipation, the uncertainty, the unspoken question of what was about to unfold. It was not a formal arena. There were no judges, no bells, no official timekeeper. Instead, the space had an intimacy that made every movement visible, every twitch noticeable. 9 witnesses had squeezed into corners, along the edges of mats, finding vantage points that allowed them to see, but not to interfere. They spoke in whispers at first, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the balance in the room. Every detail mattered. The positioning of feet, the way hands hovered just above the mat, the subtle alignment of shoulders and hips. Observers later recalled that even before the 2 men faced each other, there was a sense of inevitability in the room. It was not excitement in the traditional sense. It was a quiet tension, the kind that makes a heavy silence feel almost alive. The room itself seemed to understand the stakes. Light from the high windows cast long shadows that stretched across the mats, accentuating the slight tremor in some of the witnesses' hands. Even the sounds of breathing were noticeable, slow, controlled, measured. Everyone present understood, without being told, that this was not merely a test of strength. It was something far rarer, a test of precision, of presence, of mastery that existed quietly, deliberately, before the first movement had even been made. Bruce Lee entered without fanfare. His steps were measured, calm, almost imperceptible. He did not scan the room, did not raise his chin in challenge. Instead, he moved with the awareness of someone who needed nothing to prove, whose authority was not granted by size, nor by intimidation, nor by spectacle, but by the clarity of skill. The witnesses, although they would not articulate it at the time, felt it immediately. Every eye turned, some with curiosity, others with subtle disbelief, as the space around him seemed to contract, the air itself bending around his presence. In those first minutes, before a hand had moved or a word had been spoken, the room had already chosen sides, not in loyalty or allegiance, but in understanding. They were waiting, quietly, almost painfully, for the inevitable to unfold, and in that quiet something profound had already occurred. The muscle-bound fighter was impossible to ignore. He carried the weight of his reputation in his frame, broad shoulders, a chest that seemed carved from stone, and arms that spoke of countless hours of repetition and discipline. He did not enter the room with theatrics, but with the kind of presence that made people instinctively step back. His silence was heavy, commanding, yet it was the kind of authority built entirely on physicality. Those who knew him in the local circuit spoke of raw power, of men stepping aside before he even made a move. He had faced challengers before, and the results were always the same: awe, respect, and occasionally fear. For him, confidence was measured in pounds lifted, in the visible strain of a perfectly executed technique, in the silent declaration that he could crush anyone foolish enough to oppose him. Bruce Lee, by contrast, seemed almost out of place in the conventional sense. He was smaller, leaner, his movements unremarkable to a casual observer. Yet there was a quality in his posture that demanded attention, an awareness that suggested he saw far more than was immediately visible. He carried no weight in muscle alone, yet his presence felt as deliberate and inescapable as a shadow at dusk. The contrast between the 2 men was immediate and stark. where one radiated raw strength, the other radiated control. Where one invited challenge through size and power, the other commanded attention without demanding it. Witnesses later remarked on the odd tension that arose from simply observing them stand together. It was the meeting of two worlds, one defined by force, the other by understanding. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The larger fighter flexed subtly, testing his own reach, his own balance, as if to announce dominance without aggression. Bruce Lee, calm and unshaken, adjusted his stance quietly, his eyes assessing, measuring, and anticipating. To the untrained eye, nothing had changed. To those watching closely, a silent negotiation was taking place, a conversation conducted through posture, breathing, and the subtlest movements. In that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. It was clear to every observer that the outcome would not be determined by who could yell louder or push harder. It would be determined in the stillness, in the seconds that followed, where skill, timing, and clarity would outweigh sheer size. And though no one yet understood how, every witness sensed that the 7 seconds they were about to witness would change the meaning of confrontation forever. Time stretched in the small training hall. The two men faced each other, and yet nothing happened. Not at first. There were no preambles, no gestures of intimidation, no signals exchanged. Only a quiet, deliberate positioning, a conversation conducted entirely through stance and presence. The air itself seemed to thicken, charged by anticipation that no one dared speak aloud. The witnesses noticed small details that, in hindsight, mattered most. The slight tilt of a shoulder, the subtle flex of a wrist, a shifting of weight from one foot to the other. Each movement was so minimal that it could have been dismissed, yet together they formed a language only those attuned to martial precision could understand. It was in these moments that Bruce Lee's mastery began to assert itself, not through motion, but through the perception of inevitability. The larger fighter, confident in his physical dominance, maintained his rigid posture. His eyes scanned Bruce Lee, searching for weakness, for an opening, for the tell that would justify the reputation he carried. But Bruce Lee offered none. He did not react to posturing. He did not mirror aggression. He existed instead in a state of poised awareness, every muscle relaxed yet ready, every movement purposeful yet unseen. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Witnesses would later recall how the seconds felt like minutes, stretched thin by the expectation of what was coming. Each person in the room understood, instinctively, that the confrontation was no longer about a display of strength. It had become a study in restraint, a psychological contest where the first sign of certainty, of hesitation, could decide everything. And yet, for all the quiet, there was an undeniable energy, a building momentum that could not be ignored. Every observer felt it pressing against the walls, creeping into their awareness, settling into their chest. It was the knowledge that something extraordinary was imminent, though they could not yet define what that would be. In that long, deliberate pause, Bruce Lee's presence was absolute. He did not move to impress, he moved to understand. And in understanding, he created a quiet inevitability, an invisible line that the larger fighter was already approaching, though he did not know it. The room waited in hushed attention, knowing that the next movements, when they came, would define the story forever. The first movement was nearly imperceptible. Bruce Lee shifted his weight, a subtle repositioning that carried no force yet spoke volumes. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed inconsequential, a simple adjustment of stance. But to those who understood, it was the opening of a narrative written in motion, a quiet assertion of control that needed no words. He moved without tension, his muscles loose yet responsive, his gaze steady. Each tiny action, an angled foot, a lifted shoulder, a barely there shift of his hips, was precise, deliberate. It was the kind of mastery that relied not on speed or power alone, but on anticipation, balance, and the understanding of physics applied to human movement. Observers later recalled a sense of awe, not at violence, but at the clarity of intention. Every motion served a purpose, nothing was wasted. The larger fighter reacted instinctively, a slight tightening of the jaw, a flex of the forearm. Even without contact, the shift in Bruce Lee's presence began to influence him. Confidence, which had once seemed unshakable, wavered subtly. The muscle-bound man adjusted, seeking leverage, but with each micro-movement, it became clear that he was already negotiating a rhythm imposed by someone far smaller yet entirely certain. There were no strikes yet, no dramatic confrontation, and yet the balance of authority in the room had already begun to change. Bruce Lee demonstrated dominance not through aggression, but through clarity. Each action reduced unnecessary effort, each motion defined by intent rather than display. The witnesses would later describe the scene as quietly terrifying, a demonstration so restrained that it forced reflection rather than reaction. Even the air in the room seemed to shift. Conversations and whispers paused as the crowd unconsciously leaned forward, their attention fully consumed. They sensed that what would come next was inevitable, that 7 seconds would soon crystallize into something permanent in memory. Bruce Lee's mastery was absolute, not in spectacle, but in the quiet, decisive language of motion that required no struggle to assert itself. And then it began. Not with a roar, not with a rush, but with a subtle transfer of weight, a whisper of motion that went unnoticed by most in the room. In less than 10 heartbeats, the confrontation resolved itself. Every action Bruce Lee took was deliberate, precise, and measured. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary force, yet the result was undeniable. The larger fighter reacted, but too late. What followed was not a flurry or a struggle. It was a series of adjustments so perfectly timed that he could not compensate. One microstep, one subtle shift of the wrist, and the imbalance was created. Another, and his center of gravity betrayed him. In these 7 seconds, the muscle-bound man, renowned for his size and strength, found himself controlled without overt exertion, every movement guided, anticipated, and countered. Witnesses would later describe the moment in a single, breathless word: inevitable. They spoke of it not in excitement, but in stunned silence. There was no noise, no dramatic flair, only a quiet certainty that the outcome could not have been otherwise. Bruce Lee moved as if the space itself responded to his intent, each gesture minimal, each strike invisible in its brevity, yet completely decisive. It was not about overpowering, it was about clarity. Every motion was calculated to achieve the maximum result with the minimum effort. The larger man's strength, which had once seemed absolute, became irrelevant. Bruce Lee's efficiency and understanding of balance, timing, and leverage rendered raw power secondary. In 7 seconds, authority shifted, not through dominance displayed, but through inevitability realized. As the final instant passed, the room felt altered. The witnesses did not cheer. They did not gasp. They simply exhaled collectively, as though the air itself had been holding tension and released it only when the confrontation was complete. The moment had ended, but its imprint lingered, heavy and profound, leaving those present to quietly reconcile what they had seen, a master demonstrating in mere seconds the quiet supremacy of precision over force. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. The larger fighter, whose confidence had filled the room like a tangible weight, began to hesitate. His movements slowed, no longer guided by instinct alone. What had been effortless dominance now required thought, and thought betrayed him. Witnesses later described seeing the change ripple across his posture. Shoulders drooped slightly, his stance lost rigidity, and the certainty that had once been his armor began to fracture. Bruce Lee did not need to follow, to strike, or to assert himself further. The lesson had already been delivered. Control, after all, is as much a matter of perception as it is of motion. The muscle-bound man, once an imposing figure of raw power, was caught in the quiet authority of someone who moved not to fight, but to resolve. In every hesitation, every tiny miscalculation, the room could sense the reversal of dominance. The witnesses themselves felt the tension shift in almost physical terms. The air seemed heavier around the larger man, lighter around Bruce Lee. Conversations that had dared to stir earlier fell silent. Even breathing seemed more measured, careful. For the first time, those present realized that the outcome of the confrontation was no longer in question. The muscle-bound fighter understood, without words, that he had been outclassed. It was not humiliation shouted or inflicted, nor was it a dramatic collapse. It was subtle, a recognition of inevitability. The larger man's mental armor had cracked under the weight of clarity, precision, and observation. Bruce Lee's quiet mastery had rendered intimidation irrelevant, leaving only understanding that raw power, when unchecked by insight, could never dictate the outcome. By the time the 7 seconds had fully elapsed, the psychological transformation was complete. The witnesses saw not defeat in the larger fighter's eyes, but comprehension, a reluctant acknowledgement of skill far beyond size or reputation. And in that recognition, the room itself seemed to settle into a new order, one defined by calm authority, quiet control, and the enduring impact of silent mastery. The hall returned to its usual quiet, but it was a quiet transformed. Conversations resumed, cautiously at first, as if each person were testing the air, measuring what had just transpired. Nothing had been shouted, nothing had been displayed in spectacle, and yet the memory of those 7 seconds lingered, heavy and undeniable. Every witness carried it differently. Some replayed the sequence in their minds, trying to understand how something so brief had felt so complete. Others simply sat, silent, absorbing the subtle shift in the room. Bruce Lee made no acknowledgement. He did not look at the larger fighter, nor did he seek the approval of the crowd. He walked away with the same measured pace he had entered, his presence calm and unassuming, leaving the room changed not through force, but through the clarity of demonstration. The larger man remained for a moment, staring at the mats, processing, until he too departed, quieter than he had arrived, his confidence intact in part, but tempered by recognition. The witnesses would later recall details others might have overlooked, the way the light fell across the mats, the soft echo of footsteps, the tension that slowly dissipated. Each small observation became part of the story, proof that what had occurred was real and lasting. No one spoke of victory or defeat in the conventional sense. The moment had not been about winning. It had been about the subtle reshaping of understanding. In the days and weeks that followed, the story spread quietly among those present. It was not recounted with fanfare, nor exaggerated with each retelling. Instead, it became a reference point, a moment that defined the standard of mastery, efficiency over effort, precision over brute force, awareness over reaction. Those 9 witnesses carried the event in memory, speaking of it not to entertain but to remember, a demonstration so controlled that it required reflection, not applause. Even years later, the atmosphere of that small hall was recalled with reverence. Anyone who had observed the encounter could still feel the weight of those 7 seconds, the inevitability that had been displayed, and the subtle authority that had quietly asserted itself. It was not a story of spectacle, but of presence, an enduring reminder that true mastery is not always loud, but always felt. Years later, the incident remained alive in memory, not as a tale of confrontation, but as a lesson in understanding. The muscle-bound fighter had continued his training, his reputation intact, yet he carried with him a new awareness, one forged in those 7 seconds of quiet inevitability. It was a recognition that size and strength, though formidable, were never the sole measure of mastery. Bruce Lee's presence in that small hall had left an imprint far beyond the room itself. Those 9 witnesses who had seen what few ever would recount the story with careful precision, not for drama, not for shock, but as a testament to the subtle authority of a man who required no spectacle to demonstrate skill. Over time, the account spread, shared quietly among students, martial artists, and observers, each retelling preserving the essence, minimal motion, maximum effect, and the psychological clarity that rendered brute force secondary. The event became legend precisely because it was understated. There was no video, no public record, no fanfare. Its power lay in memory, in the way those present could still feel the weight of inevitability years later. Shaped how martial arts were understood in that community, that mastery was not about intimidation or flamboyance, but about observation, restraint, and precision. For Bruce Lee, the encounter was unremarkable in the moment, yet profound in effect. He did not claim victory, nor did he emphasize the outcome. The lesson existed silently, absorbed by those who had witnessed it, carried forward as part of his enduring legacy. In quiet spaces, far removed from crowds or cameras, his mastery spoke through action alone, a demonstration of authority that needed no audience, no applause, and no embellishment. Even decades later, those who recounted the event did so with reverent silence. The story of the 7 seconds had become more than an anecdote. It was a reflection on what mastery truly meant. It reminded all who heard it that skill, presence, and understanding could shape outcomes more decisively than force, that authority could exist quietly, and that true mastery leaves its mark not through noise, but through enduring memory. The hall itself, now faded with time, became a shrine of sorts, not in stone but in recollection. Every echo, every scuff in the mat, every long shadow cast by the windows seemed to carry a whisper of that day, a quiet reminder that the demonstration of true mastery does not need spectacle. It simply needs clarity, and the patience to let inevitability speak for itself.
I apologize, Bruce Lee. I was wrong.